I'm Aaron Thomason, usually the subject of statements like, is he supposed to be back here? I've been lurking around the Phoenix Design community for about 2.5 decades. Sounds crazy to say out loud. I have to apologize. I was supposed to get new glasses on Monday. They are not in. So now you're all blurry, but at least I can see what I'm supposed to be saying. All right. During the week, I work as a senior UX designer at SRP. I've been with the company for about 20 years. And as Laura Lee said, one of the things I do on the side that I really enjoy is doing craft beer labels for local breweries. And breweries is very hard to say. I will trip over it multiple times. But before I get into the prepared part of what I wanted to say, I want to level set. How Aaron got his creative groove back is critical with a lowercase c, probably italic, maybe in a curls font. Critical in about a 2-foot circle around my person. That said, I feel and I hope that it's relatable to those in the creative field. All of us in this room today are living in the same time and place. Maybe if there's someone on Zoom, they're in a better place. But just about every day, larger, critical, in Futura, extra bold, all capped events happen. We have to live through things. We have to process things. Rights being taken away from certain people, racism, political theater, people losing their homes, Russia and the Ukraine, climate change, COVID. Some Americans are still calling for another civil war. And somehow under that shadow, we are tasked with being creative. Our job is to design an ad that sells a bunch of widgets like it did in 2016. Get people to sign up for an app or visit a new place in town. A lot of times it's a distraction at best. Speaking for myself, any point during the day, what's happening outside can come rushing back in and burst my little creative bubble. Case in point, some weeks ago I was at a hardware store on my lunch break. I needed a wrench for a project I was working on that weekend. Quick in and out trip, I had to be back for a meeting. I was at the checkout, fourth in line behind 2 guys who were dusty and sweaty, obviously from working outdoors. The first guy in line at the counter, camo hat, shredded American flag t-shirt. He was in line talking with the clerk. He was asking about the gun safes that were on sale at the front of the store. He asked how they were selling. Pretty good, those will be gone today, but we have more coming in. Seems like lots of people have lots of guns. Camo hat's response, in the whole range of anything he could have said. We're ready for war and I hope it comes, we'll kill them all. Yeah. The flex of what used to be internet muscles floored me. I really wanted to ask who them all was in the context. Then I noticed the handgun sticking out of the back of his jeans. For once, I actually thought about how it could play out and didn't say anything. This wasn't Twitter, this wasn't Facebook, it wasn't a gun show or Cabela's. It was a hardware store. I grew up in northern Arizona and have no problem with guns. But when someone is armed and seems like they're looking for a fight, something's wrong. Personally, it's difficult for me to come back from that, and then I get back to my desk and have to say, alrighty, let's get this smart thermostat presentation done. Woohoo, right? I have a few friends in the creative industry who are at the other end of the spectrum. They're somehow delightfully unaware of what's going on in the world. They're not stressed out at all. They're blissfully ignorant when the conversation comes to current events. Is ignorance the best response here in a creative space? I feel like we have to at least be present to do our jobs well. But maybe if it's self-preservation, I don't know. I'll talk in a little bit about cutting out all the non-essential activities in my life for a little bit. But one of the things I didn't skip was Creative Mornings. This enriches me. This time is critical to me. And even though I don't know all of you, the people in this community is critical to me. At the end of this space, I'm going to open it up to you and ask you a question. How do you, my peers, stay creative in this world? So just something to noodle on while I go through this. I don't want to be leaving here empty-handed, and I feel like we could all use a little boost. Sharing is caring, as they say. So with that out of the way, sorry to bring the party down. Years ago, Robin Williams said Canada is like a really nice apartment over a meth lab. We know what Calgary's chapter meant when they chose critical as the topic. So on to the subject. A little bit about me. I know some of you might be thinking that 2 decades at a power company sounds like a super sexy gig. But I have to confess, it hasn't been the same job or the same department the whole time. I've been in some kind of design role since 2002 when I was first hired to redesign the external customer website. I was a contractor at the time, and back then the web team was small. 1 writer, 1 developer, a part-time designer, and a supervisor. But hey, this web thing might take off. It's not Google, but since then I've gotten to witness some cool changes in the industry. Our entire goal is to get customers to use less of the products that we produce, power and water. That presents its own challenges. I was there when the new feature called paperless billing rolled out. Text message alerts, auto payment from a checking account. What a time to be alive. Environmental changes too. Widespread solar adoption, whole home batteries, now the rise of electric vehicles. It's like the Jetsons in my cubicle. It's been interesting, but critical. I'm going to be honest with you, this was a hard topic for me. Not only does it mean so many things to different people, but when they first asked me to speak and gave me the topic, I asked, with all the craziness and actual crises going on in the world, what made you think of me? And the answer was, well, working at a power company, we thought you might have some interesting stories about critical work. Fair enough. But the truth is, when it comes to what's considered a utility, the ability to really stick the text hierarchy on a web page, really low on the list. I'm more like the guy that details the fire truck than the one that drives it to the building and saves people from burning. My Mac doesn't have a button marked, generate reliable electricity for 2 million people. And I don't know the key command for help manage water for the largest municipality in the Southwest through the longest drought on record. It might be on there, but I don't know. Maybe it's a PC function. Monsoon in Phoenix is the perfect time to illustrate this point. Anyone's power go out recently because of a storm? You know who they don't call when lightning takes out a tree or a power line? The designer. Yeah. My important work comes from a usability role where on a team now, I get to advocate for the accessibility of users for our websites and programs. But even then, I wouldn't say it's critical. Not in the grand scheme of things. It's important, but if my job doesn't fall under a loose interpretation of critical, what could I talk about today? Communications at a utility is pretty much built around a calendar. Summer, it's always going to be hot. This is energy efficiency messages. Monsoon, outages and storm safety. Winter, check that insulation and get your house tested for duct leaks. I just saved you a year's worth of marketing right there. See, SRP is a science-based company. Hydrologists, forecasters, engineers keep this thing running. This is a challenge for creatives to work with. These engineers just don't see my vision. The good news is that it really levels the playing field. It tends to take opinions off the table. It's one thing to go into a presentation and say, I feel like this call to action better embodies our brand position and will probably work better. To go in and say, we ran these options through some users and this one tested better by 42%. There you go. Doesn't matter what the color is, doesn't matter what it says, this one tested better. The hard part for me, being visual, is that in this data-driven world, suddenly the sandbox we're in gets a little bit smaller right from go. And it's not bad, it's just a different constraint. Internal clients who just say, blue sky something, whatever you want. They feel like they're lifting creative limitations, but they're really just making us the heavy. We come back with, here's what users say they want, here's what tested well. It's never what the business partner had in mind. It's never what the designers had in mind. Years of push and pull of trying to make the same messages interesting and engaging had worn me down. That designer BO set in and it stunk. Burnout. I was just going through the motions. I bet that most of you at some point have felt burned out in your creative careers. In the design field, it's kind of a given. I read a statistic that over half of designers stay in the same position for less than 3 years now. A huge percentage leave the field altogether after 5 years. Less than 15% stay longer than 11. So if we've got anybody here at the 12-year mark, you are in a really, really small minority. I got to the point where I didn't feel creative at all. I didn't want to sit at a computer. I didn't want to sit in meetings. I didn't want to talk to our business partners. I was done being a designer. Problem is, that's all I know how to do. Being a designer was who I was. You know, people in the creative field get a lot of our identity out of these roles. And if you get to the point where you're done, I mean, what do you do with that? It took a lot. I was a designer all day at work. I had freelance clients who relied on me for help. In the evenings, I helped friends and family work on their blogs and their social media things, and it was my whole life. If you burn out on who you are, suddenly you're into some existential level type stuff, right? For example, what's one of the first questions that we asked someone today when we met them? What do you do? It's not really probably proper to say, who are you? But, you know, we default to what do you do? Because we try to categorize people. And it's not bad necessarily, but it lets us know that, okay, I can relate to them on this level. My wife has started saying, tell me about yourself, which I think is genius, and it's a lot better than tell me who you are. Anyway, has anyone ever answered you when you ask them that with something that isn't an occupation? It's jarring. It's weird. They say something like, I live in a tiny house with my dog and I love taking photos of wildlife. We're not used to that level of whatever that is. Honesty or transparency or self-awareness. I'm a designer and I too like being out of doors occasionally. Or worse, from personal experience, you say something dumb like, for a living? For a job? For money? That goes over real well. On one hand, I looked at other career options. And on the other, I also began looking for something that would give me back the charge I used to get from design. Local illustrator, host of the 3-Point Perspective podcast, Jake Parker, calls it refilling your creative bank account. If all we do every day is withdraw creativity out of ourselves, eventually the account is overdrawn. We have to work on replenishing the supply. Personally, I like automotive references better than accounting ones, so I call it my creative fuel tank. People who know me have heard me say, I'm not the most creative person in the room. It's not a self-deprecating ding. I just know how my brain works, my process, and how it doesn't. The CreativeMornings manifesto says everyone is creative, but in a room of designers, songwriters, artists, I tend to be kind of on this end of the continuum. My creative fuel tank is kind of shallow as it is. So I buckled down. I began to read books, design books, business books, fiction, nonfiction. I took classes. I signed up for conferences. I signed up for every meetup I could make work. I listened to creativity podcasts nonstop. I basically made my entire life about absorbing it so I could then turn around and squeeze it back out. That doesn't work. I learned a lot, found some great resources. I have a bookcase full of books now that I could loan out. But honestly, I felt more creatively drained than ever. I felt like all I'd done was fill my calendar, but my tank was still on E. So eventually, I stopped. I stopped buying books. I stopped going to events. I stopped hanging out with my friends. I withdrew from the extras I was trying to force myself to participate in to save some of what I had left. One thing I did do for myself, though, was I spent my evenings drawing. Ever since I was little, that's what I've enjoyed. Even today, give me a box of crayons and a scrap of paper and I'm happy. It wasn't work-related, so it gave me a little bit of a creative bump, a little outlet. And more importantly, it afforded me some time to sit with the things I've learned during my creative drinking from the firehouse session. One of the last books I read was one I'd owned for years, called Design as a Job by Mike Montero. There's no hidden meaning, no twist at the end. It's mostly written from a freelance and agency perspective, but it's literally about how design is a job. Montero puts it this way: contrary to popular belief, designers are not artists. We employ artistic methods to visualize thinking and process, but unlike artists, we work to solve a client's problem, not present our own view of the world. We thrive on constraints, but we hate compromise. If a design project is to be considered successful, and success is the true measure of quality, it must not only add an aesthetic dimension, but solve the problem at hand. I love that line. We thrive on constraints, but we hate compromise. What this says to me that design, the process of design, the discipline of design, is about finding a solution to a problem. And I sat with that. And then eventually it clicked for me. I like solving problems. That's what I liked about being a designer. It wasn't I was going to make a joke about the black turtlenecks, but nobody does that anymore, so showing my age. But I like helping people through solving their problems. And that was the charge that I got out of design, because I was still doing design. I just didn't enjoy it. So the funny thing was that it wasn't even a self-help book. It was a business book. For me, I made the conscious effort to shift my mind from, we've done this every year for 10 years. Why are we having this meeting? To approaching every task with the mindset of, how can I help this person accomplish their goal? I don't have to agree with their goal, but that's their goal. My job is to try to make it successful. What? That little tweak, that little attitude adjustment helped me. Rather than pull up the mental list of, here's all the things we've done for them in the past, I tried seeing every request as a new challenge, as a new problem to solve for them, and subsequently for our customers. And because this isn't a fairy tale, it's not all bluebirds and rainbows. Meetings get awkward, projects go out of scope, budgets get tight, schedules crunched. And many times the solve for a given problem is exactly the same one that we did last year or the year before. But making the effort to step back and see the ask as a new challenge with new constraints helps it keep it fresh for me. And the business partners appreciate it. The business partners know if you're mailing it in. We like to think that maybe they don't. Maybe you wear your emotions a little bit better than I do. Yeah, I'm terrible. I don't play poker for a reason. Even if we end up with the same tactics as the last year, the process feels new. So the work feels new. I can't tell you how many times I've watched a client tiptoe around changes or requests to a project, finally admitting that they didn't want to hurt the designer's feelings with feedback. Design is a job, remember? This isn't a criticism of the design team or their skills. It takes some practice to separate ourselves from the work, but it's worth it. It is really freeing to be in that meeting and tell them, this is your project. I'm making these recommendations based on experience or training or research and best practices, but it's your project. At the end of the day, it's your call. The bigger critical realization here is that my job is not who I am. It took me a lot of years to get to that point. My job is what I trade some of my time for in exchange for a paycheck. My job is not personal. It's a transaction. I would like to offer to you that your job is not who you are either, even freelancers. But you're the only one that can make that decision. Remember a few minutes ago when I said I started drawing again? Not only did that little activity give me a boost, but it turned into a pretty fun side business too. Laura Lee mentioned it earlier. I want to tell you how I fell into the Arizona craft beer scene after trying to kick the door in for years. Some years ago, on my way home from work one evening, I was sitting literally parked on the 51. It was summer, my old car, temperature gauge climbing. Watching the gauge, I decided if I didn't get off the freeway right then, it was going to overheat. Turns a bad day to worse real quick. I inched my way over to the off-ramp and bailed out. Sitting at the Bethany home light, I pulled out my phone. I wanted to find someplace cool to sit and let the car cool off. Yelp didn't disappoint. One of Phoenix's best-rated craft beer bars was right around the corner, right off the freeway. I parked, waited a minute to see if the radiator was going to overflow, grabbed my sketchbook and my pens and headed inside. At the time, for a place with hundreds of 5-star ratings and the largest beer selection in the valley, the Whining Pig was small, like 20 chairs small. A huge multicolor menu was written on the wall in chalk with different colors for each kind of beer, a subsection for wine. The nerd in me said, "They have an infographic. This is my place." The entire place was chalkboard walls, though. The parts that didn't have the menu had an assortment of doodles and masterpieces from what I assume was the night before, because the place was empty. The bartender was in there alone, sitting on the bar, playing his guitar. After my eyes adjusted, I sat down, ordered something cold, and soaked up the AC. I pulled out my sketchbook, and the bartender went back to his guitar. A couple of regulars came in, and he went over and chatted with them, leaving me alone. As I doodled in my sketchbook, I thought about the names these bars have. The Whining Pig. Why was it whining? The obvious answer was something either to do with cruelty or bacon, so I sketched out a couple of other possibilities. And decided that the pig was howling because he'd knocked over his beer. I was sure the car was still hot, so I hung out for a bit longer and ordered another one. When the bartender came back, he saw what I was drawing. "Did you just draw that?" I explained yes, here's my logic, and then he asked me if he could have it. Given this was a rough ink doodle in a sketchbook that I'd made by hand, the book would probably fall apart if I tore it out, so I said, "How about I take a picture in good light, and I'll send it to you?" He's like, "I'm one of the owners, and we don't have a logo. Would you be willing to sell us that?" My brain took a second to get back into designer mode. This is a really rough sketch. It's not vector. It's crude. It's not even digital. You can't do this. You can't do anything with this, and he wants to buy it? So I downshift into design professional gear. I explained I'd be happy to talk to him about it, but he should really let me clean it up, do a vector version, create a real logo out of it. At least let me digitize it. But he's adamant. Sure, digitize it, but I want that version, because that's the one you made here. It wasn't that the graphic was so good, because it wasn't. It was the story that went with it. I eventually went on to update a version of that graphic finally, where I was able to fix the pig's knee and some of the things that bothered me about the original pen. But over the course of the next few years, I created an entire line of swag for that brewery and their chain. They have 5 shops around the valley, as well as 2 Pigtails cocktail bars that I also got to work on. That drawing is still on the wall at the original Whining Pig. And it's wild to walk downtown or up at Desert Ridge and see what started out as a doodle in a 6-foot copper medallion hanging on the wall. Fast forward several years to early 2020, and I just discovered a new brewery called Simple Machine had just opened up near my house. I'd popped in a few times, and the atmosphere was great. It was a fun place to draw. And one evening, I was there drawing on my iPad. The owner, Marshall, came over and asked me what I was working on. I explained that I love to come to breweries, and I love to be here and draw, but sometimes I don't know what to draw. So I pull up a generator on Reddit, and it throws out a word. Today's prompt happened to be Cyclops. I then explained that I thought it would be funnier if my Cyclops was standing at the counter at a Sunglass Hut, angry that of course nothing fit. He laughed about that, and we talked a bit more, and said, after he found out I was a designer, he asked if I'd be interested in working on a label for them. My first label project is happening, finally. It wasn't because I went out of my way to send out a mailer or bother the owner. It was because I was just doing what I like to do, and I was recharging my batteries. And he saw something in that activity that drew him over and said, hey, I want to talk to this guy. Everyone knows the rest of 2020 went sideways. The brewery had to pivot. They put in a canning line to get to-go orders going. So the project went from one label to 3 to a whole line in really short order, and it was a blast to work on. They have several designers now working on their stuff, and I'm still a part of that process. Since the brewing industry in Arizona is small, word of mouth plays a big part. Every week I'm doing at least one project for someone, and while it's technically work, it's still super fun. And honestly, can you come into the office for a meeting hits differently when the office is a tap room. The best part is, this process fills my creative fuel tank. It helps me be content at my day job, which is, let's be honest, the one that pays the bills, the one that makes all the rest of my life basically possible. That's where the stress was coming from, is if you don't like this and you have to find something to replace it, where do you go? Now I don't have to. I'm getting my charge elsewhere. That cycle continues because then I'm happy at my day job, I come back and I deal with a brewery and I'm happy about that project. Have I turned into some kind of weird creative superhero? No. I'm still on this end of the continuum. But I feel better about my days and my work in general. It is super patronizing to say, just find yourself a passion project and get that pep back in your step, right? It doesn't work that way. We're busy. We have clients and families and bills and that giant list of garbage that was hanging over our head at the beginning that I talked about. But if you're feeling stuck and fighting burnout, I would encourage you to be open to the idea that maybe the fix isn't more or different, but maybe it's less. Maybe it's just about taking time to be with yourself and doing the things that you like to do, the things that enrich you. You don't have to make money at everything. We have this hustle culture where, well, this is my side hustle. Or maybe it's just something you do because you enjoy it. That's okay. We need that. That's kind of the end of my piece of this, and I want to field some questions, but I do want to hear from you if we have a few minutes. How do you, if anybody be willing to talk, how do you stay creative in this world?